What's up, everybody? Welcome back to The Truth About the Market. I'm your host, Jason Zilberbrand, president of VREF. I've appraised aircraft for the FAA, SpaceX, Fortune 50 companies, lenders, operators, famous estates, and private owners around the world. I've owned aircraft, I've sold aircraft, I've operated my own aircraft. I've watched deals fall apart for reasons that never make it into a broker listing. And this podcast, it's sponsor-free. There's no paid-for opinions. There's no commercial pressure, just the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And today's episode is an interesting one because there's a growing disconnect in aviation that most people can feel, but very few can articulate. New airplanes aren't just expensive, they're misaligned. Prices no longer track capability. Product lines no longer map to real missions. And the buyers showing up today look nothing like the buyers this industry was designed around for decades. This episode is about that disconnect. Not about one airplane, and it's not about one OEM, but it's about the collapse of the progression that used to define general aviation and business aviation alike. Because for most of modern aviation history, there was a ladder. You started somewhere reasonable, you stretched a little, and you moved up as your mission and your income and your experience grew. And it wasn't cheap, but it was logical. You could see the next step and you could justify it. Well, in 2026, that ladder officially no longer exists. What replaced it isn't broken, it's intentional. It's a series of disconnected platforms, each priced for a very specific buyer profile, with no obligation to help anyone move between them. That shift didn't happen by accident. It's the result of certification costs, liability exposure, margin pressure, and one very clear realization by OEMs, which is fewer buyers with more money is safer than more buyers with lighter margins, right? Who wants to sell more when they can sell less and make more money? And once you understand that, everything else in the market starts to make sense. From $1 million pistons, oh boy, wait to hear about this, to $5 million turboprops, to light jets that no longer pretend to be entry-level points. So before we talk about specific airplanes, before we talk about Mooney and Cirrus and turboprops and jets, we need to talk about why the ladder itself disappeared. Because if you don't understand that, every buying decision you make from here on out will feel confusing, frustrating, and probably irrational. This episode is about reconnecting the logic and exposing the truth behind how the new aircraft market actually works now. Historically, aviation worked like a ladder. You started somewhere realistic, you stretched, you moved up. And here now, and someday I might be there, right? That was the mentality. And I think a lot of people, and they've seen this in product lines like Cirrus or Piper or Beech, their aircraft were designed to move up the ladder. And that ladder existed for decades. But in 2026, the ladder is gone because, what we got to do is start at the bottom. Because that's where the silence is the loudest. And general aviation used to be really noisy. There used to be new models all the time, refreshments, replacements, more announcements. Today, what do we see? Well, they killed the Bonanza. They killed the Baron. We knew that was happening. There's no piston twin worth talking about anymore. There's no clean sheet attempt to rebuild the aspirational but reachable GE airplane. There's a lot of folks that talk about FADEC this or what an aircraft is missing, but that absence tells you more than any press release ever could. It tells you that OEMs have run the math and decided that mid-market GA buyers are no longer worth designing aircraft around because the certification costs have exploded. The margins are too thin. And where are all these buyers? Well, let's talk about the buyers because, the ones that do exist today, they're super knowledgeable. They're super demanding. They comparison shop aggressively, and increasingly they're willing to buy a used aircraft because from a business standpoint, it's a nightmare. GA doesn't shrink with announcement, it shrinks quietly. And when something disappears quietly, it's because the business case failed, not the airplane. And that's an important distinction. The Bonanza didn't fail as an airplane. The Baron didn't fail as an airplane. They failed as products. And once you understand that, the rest of the market starts to look very different. Now let's reset something that has gotten completely distorted, price memory. Because one of the reasons today's market feels insane is because people have lost historical context. In the early 2000s, even into the 20 teens, A high-end piston airplane was expensive, but it was still psychologically connected to a professional, successful career. You didn't need generational wealth. You didn't need a family office. You didn't need to be insulated from reality. You needed a business that worked, you needed income, and you needed discipline. That's what mattered. And a new high-end piston airplane felt like an achievement. It wasn't an outlier. Well, let's fast forward to today, because that same conceptual category now lives north of $1 million, and in some cases, well north of that, without a proportional increase in capability, and certainly not in earnings, because the airplane didn't suddenly become twice as useful. The buyer pool changed. That's the part almost nobody wants to say out loud. These airplanes aren't priced where they are because of innovation alone. They're priced where they are because the intended buyer is fundamentally different. That's where the ladder is broken, because when the bottom rung disappears, everything above it just floats. There's no natural progression anymore. Instead of I start here and I move up to this, the market now says pick the platform that matches your wealth profile, not your mission profile. That's a profound shift. And it explains why so many buyers feel disoriented. They're not confused because they don't understand airplanes. They're confused because the rules changed without notice. OEMs didn't announce it. They didn't just explain it. They just executed fewer models, higher prices. Less concern about the less concern about the volume and more concern about where the buyer installation is. Because this is where we need to be very clear. This isn't temporary. It's not post-COVID distortion. This is not a supply chain hangover. This isn't inflation working its way through the system. This is a structural repositioning of the entire new aircraft market. OEMs learned something over the last decade. Selling fewer airplanes at much higher margins is safer than selling more airplanes to price-sensitive buyers. Fewer customers, less support burden, less volatility, less exposure, less liability, so on and so forth. And once that realization sets in, there's no incentive to go back to the way it used to be. That's why the ladder wasn't repaired. That's why there's no pressurized twins. That's why there's no pressurized singles. Hell, there's so few aircraft even worth looking at today where maybe there's brand new technology. Anyway, I want to move on because we are going to start talking about some aircraft. I'm going to talk about the new Mooney because yes, there's an announcement coming, and you're probably going to hear about it by the time you hear this episode launch next week, because they're back and they've got new aircraft priced, and we'll let the market speak. And I'm going to talk about Cirrus. I'm going to talk about turboprops and light jets, and I'm going to talk about all the new airplanes that are coming out, because none of these airplanes are accidents. They're perfectly rational products for the buyers they're built for. The problem is that many people listening to this show are no longer the intended audience, and that's uncomfortable and it's sad. It's also empowering if you understand it early, because once you accept that new aircraft are no longer designed as stepping stones, you stop making emotional decisions trying to keep up with the market that's moved on. That's where the real advantage starts. Did you know VREF does more appraisals than anyone else in the market? With thousands of aircraft appraisals completed every year, why trust anybody else? Go to vref.com to learn more. So let's shift. Let's talk about the airplane that made this impossible to ignore. Yes, it's the $1.8 million Mooney. Let's talk about why it exists, who it's actually for, what it tells us about where general aviation is really headed today. Because this airplane didn't just raise eyebrows, it broke people's internal logic. For a lot of pilots, including myself, the pricing is maybe a little bit offensive. Maybe it's a little bit confusing. And for a lot of industry people, it felt like something nobody wanted to say out loud, so let's just say it. The $1.8 million Mooney exists because there is a buyer willing to pay that price, and that buyer is not who most pilots think it is. On paper, the Acclaim is still a phenomenal aircraft. It's fast, it's efficient. You can fly it as an owner. It's got a decent set of legs. It's got retract gear. It's got a great avionics suite. The Mooney's never had a speed issue. That's not the debate here. The debate is price. And what the price tells you, right? At $1.8 million, this airplane is no longer competing with other piston aircraft. I mean, you have to be crazy. It's competing with entry-level turboprops. It's competing with high-quality used PC-12s. It's competing with Learjets. Let that sink in. And critically, used aircraft with far more capability per dollar. So why does it exist? Because Mooney isn't selling transportation, they're selling identity. And identity purchases operate under completely different rules. The buyer's not asking what else I could buy for this money. They're asking, does this airplane align with how I see myself? That's a dangerous question, but it's a powerful one because the Mooney buyer at this price point tends to share a very specific profile. They're speed obsessed. They value purity over practicality. They want to fly themselves. They're going to reject every used aircraft categorically. They don't want to manage complexity, right? They don't want to fly a carbon fiber aircraft. And most importantly, they are financially insulated from depreciation logic. And that last part really matters because when depreciation doesn't hurt or it doesn't matter, logic softens. This isn't a buyer stretching to afford an airplane. Oh my God, could you imagine if somebody called a bank to borrow the money? This is a buyer choosing an airplane because it feels right to him or to her. And OEMs understand this buyer extremely well. That's why the price is not an accident. It's a filter. Because at $1.8 million, Mooney is not trying to sell volume. They are trying to sell exclusivity. They might have intentionally just narrowed that funnel. And I'm hoping that they sell a bunch of these, but at 1.8, I don't think it's going to happen. Anyway, and here's the uncomfortable truth. That strategy, it can work for a while because boutique markets always work in strong confidence environments. But where it gets dangerous is when confidence cracks, because this buyer disappears quickly when psychology shifts, folks. Not because they can't afford the airplane, but because they no longer feel compelled to justify it or what it costs. And that's where the risk lives. Now, let's contrast that with other dominant piston manufacturer in the room, the Cirrus, because if Mooney is selling identity, Cirrus is selling risk management. Cirrus doesn't sell speed, they sell certainty. They got a parachute. They sell standardized training and predictable ownership. And insurance and financing and resale are all very familiar. And Cirrus buyers don't want to feel like pilots. They want to feel like responsible aircraft owners. That difference explains almost everything. And at $1.2 million, Cirrus feels reasonable to its buyer base because it's not perceived as a single object. It's perceived as a system, as a culture. The airplane is one part of a broader ownership experience designed to minimize anxiety. And Mooney, by contrast, is the experience. There's no safety narrative. There's no ecosystem. There's no psychological off-ramp. You're buying the airplane and everything that comes with it. That's not bad. It's just narrower. And narrow markets, as you guys know, I say this all the time, they behave very differently when conditions change. And this brings us to the most important psychological trap in new aircraft market. Buyers consistently say, I know it doesn't make sense on paper, but I want new. That sentence comes up constantly. And what it really means is this: I'm paying to remove uncertainty. Look, I'm one of them. A lot of people, they don't want to buy somebody's pre-owned goods. They see pre-owned aircraft or pre-owned property as damaged goods. New is not about performance. New is not about technology. New is about emotional insurance. There's no previous owner. There's nothing hidden. There's nothing lurking. There's no questionable maintenance or no questionable this or that. There's no stories. There's nothing left off from a spec standpoint. And God, I can't tell you how many times that comes up because buying a used aircraft, you're never going to check all the boxes, but buying new, you will. Buying new, you're going to get everything you want. But that relief has a price, and OEMs price it aggressively. But here's the danger. When enough buyers make decisions this way, markets become detached from fundamentals because emotional insurance doesn't resell well, and that's where valuation mistakes happen. This is where I see the most trouble in the real world deals. Owners anchor their expectations to new prices, and buyers assume scarcity equals performance and high value, and lenders will stretch that because replacement cost can support it until it doesn't. Because replacement cost is not value, it's an emotional anchor. And emotional anchors fail when confidence shifts. That $1.8 million Mooney is not a bad airplane. I'm going to say it again, probably because I'm going to get phone calls about it. It's not a bad airplane, but it is a signal. It tells you that general aviation has moved into a phase where new aircraft are luxury goods and emotional buyers set pricing and volume is secondary to profit margins. And stepping stone logic no longer applies, at least not mainstream. That doesn't mean you shouldn't buy one. It means you need to know what game you're playing, because if you think you're buying transportation, you're going to be disappointed. And if you think you're buying an appreciating asset, boy, are you going to be hurt. All right, let's move past the pistons entirely and talk about why turboprops quietly became the real entry point for serious buyers and for aspiring pilots, and why that shift matters far more than most people realize. And it's because once buyers cross a certain psychological and financial threshold, something very important happens. They stop talking about airplanes the way pilots talk about airplanes, and they start talking about them the way capital allocators talk about assets. That threshold today sits somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million. Below that numbers, buyers debate features, and above that numbers, buyers debate risk. And that's why turboprops quietly became the real entry point for serious buyers, even though nobody framed it this way. This is where the piston versus the turbine argument ends. Not because turbines are better, but because the buyer's mindset changes. It's at the turboprop level. Nobody's asking how fast it goes. They're asking how often does it fly? How predictable is dispatch reliability? How ugly can ownership really get? How does this aircraft behave when the markets soften? Those are not pilot questions. Those are ownership questions. And turboprops answer them better than pistons ever could. And let's talk about why. Because a modern turboprop buyer is usually coming from one of three places. They're upgrading out of a high-end piston and tired of weather sensitivity and maintenance variability and psychological fatigue. They're stepping down from a light jet and realizing they don't actually need a jet or the jet speed for their mission. Or they're first-time turbine buyers who understand that reliability matters more than ego. That third group is growing fast, and OEMs know it, and that's why turbo pricing now lives where it does. A PC-12 NGX at roughly $6 million isn't priced that way because Pilatus thinks it's a jet. It's priced that way because buyers accept it as a professional tool. They don't love it, they trust it. And trust is incredibly expensive. A TBM 960 around $5 million sells a different promise, not maximum flexibility, but time efficiency. Because TBM buyers are usually very specific about how they use airplanes. They want speed. They want point-to-point efficiency. They want turbine reliability without jet complexity. And they're not going to be an emotional shopper, right? They're surgical. The Piper M700 Fury at roughly $4 million, slightly below that. And that's not accidental either. Piper understands that there is still a buyer who wants turbine reliability but cannot psychologically cross the $5 million threshold. And that line matters more than OEMs will ever admit publicly, because once you cross it, buyers start comparing your aircraft against used jets. Whether they say it out loud or not, it's happening. Now, here's the important part. Turboprops didn't win because pistons failed. They won because pistons became emotionally exhausting at higher price points. At $800,000, a piston feels like a compromise you can manage. At $1.5 million, it feels like a gamble. At $2 million, it feels irresponsible, even if it's technically defensible. That's why the piston argument collapses at scale. Want the unfiltered side of aviation? Hit subscribe and tell a friend who's shopping for a jet. We built this show for people who live and breathe aviation. Brokers, lenders, appraisers, operators, buyers, sellers. If that's you, join the conversation. This podcast is powered by your curiosity and your trust, so keep sending your stories, your wins, and your horror deals. And this brings us to the Beechcraft Denali, which is one of the most misunderstood programs in aviation right now. People talk about the Denali as if it's just another turboprop or a Pilatus wannabe. It's not. The Denali is a case study in what GA is still allowed to be. It's a clean sheet design. It's new engine architecture with the GE catalyst. It's got modern aerodynamics. It's pressurized. It can still handle larger turboprop cabin missions. And with a purchase price of around $5 million, let's talk about what the elephant in the room is. It's certification delays. The Denali has been delayed long enough that people joke about it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Those delays are not just engineering issues. They're economic filters, because the only way a clean sheet GA aircraft survives today is if the OEM believes it can amortize risk across decades, not a production run. That's a massive shift from how a GA used to work. In the past, you could justify an airplane program on volume or broad appeal or steady replacement demand. Today, You justify it on long-term service revenue, high-margin buyers, brand reinforcement, and fleet durability. The Denali isn't trying to grow GA. It's trying to capture the top end of what GA is allowed to be. That's why it exists, and that's why it will likely succeed, assuming execution holds. But notice what it's missing. There is no Denali Lite. There is no entry Denali. There's no attempt to cascade technology downward. GA no longer trickles down, folks. It leaps up. And that's the pattern you need to internalize, because once you understand that, the jet market starts to make a lot more sense. Because at the turboprop level, buyers stop dreaming and start allocating. They accept higher acquisition costs and higher operating costs, and they have higher expectations. And that is in exchange for predictability and stability and professionalism. And look, those turboprop markets are as stable gets. Residual values as stable gets. And they fly under the radar, no pun intended. And that mindset carries directly into jets, which is why they stopped being democratization tools and became identity purchases in disguise. That's where things get really interesting. By the time a buyer reaches the turboprop level, something subtle but important has already happened. They've stopped asking whether they can afford the airplane and started asking what that airplane says about them. That's the psychological bridge between turboprops and jets, and it's why light jet market looks the way it does in 2026, because light jets were never really about transportation. They were about arrival. When VLJs first entered the conversation many years ago, they were framed as the same democratization tools. The jet or the pitch was simple. Jets would become accessible. Sounds familiar. Operating complexity would shrink. Sound familiar. Ownership would feel less intimidating, and pilots could finally step up without stepping into insanity. God, all this sounds so familiar. That story didn't survive reality. What actually happened is that VLJ slowly transformed into identity purchases with wings. Let's start with the pricing, because this is where the fantasy collapsed. An M2 Gen 3 today is $6 million. A CJ4 Gen 3, 10 to 11 million. A Phenom 300E sits around 10 million as well. Come on, folks. How are these tools and how are these priced for the general masses? These are filter prices. And these levels, the buyer's no longer comparing airplanes. They're comparing self-image, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Very few people actually need a jet at this level. What they need is the sentence, I own a jet. That sentence carries weight. It carries legitimacy. It carries social signaling. It carries perceived success. And look, the OEMs understand this. That's why VLJs didn't get simpler. They got bigger, heavier, more complex, more expensive, because complexity reinforces legitimacy. Now let's talk about why, or specifically about Textron. And because their strategy is often misunderstood, Textron does not view the citation lineup as individual airplanes. They view it as a continuum of identity. The M2 is not an entry-level jet. It's a permission slip. The CJ4 is not a light jet. It's a status stabilizer. And the reason the CJ4 Gen 3 matters so much has very little to do with performance. The Gen 3 is not a revolutionary airplane. Same airframe, same mission envelope, same economics. What changed is the psychological framing. G3000 Prime, emergency auto land, auto throttles, a modernized cockpit. These features don't dramatically change what the airplane does. They change how the buyer feels about owning it. And that's critical, because Textron understands something that many buyers don't consciously articulate. If used citation values collapse, new citation demand collapses with them. That's the real risk Textron is managing. So the Gen 3 isn't about pushing performance. It's about resetting the psychological bar. It says this airplane is still modern. It's still relevant. That matters immensely when buyers are staring at used mid-sized jets with larger cabins and longer range for the exact same amount of money. The CJ4 Gen 3 exists to keep buyers from drifting upward too fast. It's a defensive move, and I think it's a smart one. But it also reveals something important about the market. Look, light jets are no longer stepping stones. They're about holding ground. Let's talk about the Phenom 300, because Embraer plays a different game. Embraer And the Phenom 300 has always leaned into cabin comfort, fit and finish, perceived quality, and owner satisfaction. And Phenom buyers tend to be less transactional and more experimental. That is why and how they care about this airplane. It's not just about what it does, right? That's why the 300 holds value so well. It's not because it's the best on paper. It's because buyers feel really good owning it. It's a really good, safe aircraft. It's a safe decision to make. And again, that's not aviation logic. That's human logic. Now, here's where things get dangerous for buyers, because once you cross into that 9, 10, $11 million range, the comparison set explodes. Suddenly, you're looking at used Challengers and used Falcons and bigger used Citations. And those airplanes offer real cabins with real baggage space, with tremendous range and real ramp presence. And this is where buyers fall into the most common trap in business aviation, because they ask, why wouldn't I just buy more airplane for the same money? That question feels rational, doesn't it? But it ignores something critical, because those larger airplanes come with crew requirements sometimes. Higher maintenance exposure for sure. They're super complex. They require a ton of support. It's just a different ownership psychology. And this is why light jets still survive today. They survive not because they're the optimal aircraft, but because they're comfortable compromises. They let buyers say, I own a jet, without saying, I own an operation. That distinction matters. And it's why VLJs didn't disappear. They just stopped being democratizers. They became containment devices. They keep buyers in a manageable complexity zone while still delivering the emotional payoff. That's also why prices keep drifting upward without killing demand, because demand at this level isn't elastic in the traditional sense. It's ego elastic. Buyers don't drop out because prices rise. They drop out when the story stops working. And that's the key risk in this segment. Not performance, not economics, but narrative. All right, let's move past light jets. Let's talk about the most dangerous shopping territory in aviation. It's the $12 to $18 million zone. It's where a lot of these new aircraft are hovering and where they live. The Citation Ascend, the Honda Jet Echelon, used mid-sized jets colliding. That's where good decisions go to die if you don't know what you're doing. And honestly, it's because once buyers cross out the light jet category, they enter the most dangerous airspace in the entire market. It's not because the airplanes are bad. It's because it is so competitive. The decision-making gets sloppy. This is the zone where logic, ego, mission creep, and financial justification all collide at once, because roughly $12 to $18 million is where more bad aviation decisions are made than anywhere else. And so let's talk about some good airplanes. Let's talk about where we're going with a lot of these new models. Let's talk about the Citation Ascend, because on its own merits, the Ascend is a great aircraft. It's got flat floor cabin. Say that 3 times. It's got larger windows, modern avionics. The engines have been updated. Yes, it's a refresh of the XLS lineage, and pricing at $15 million. Well, it seems a little high to me, but depending on configuration. And here's the problem. But $15 million. God, that sounds crazy when you say it out loud. Nobody shops in a vacuum at $15 million. They shop with one browser tab open for used mid-sized jets, because there's Challengers and Falcons and Citations, and those airplanes offer something the Ascend cannot, no matter what it is or how new it is. Volume, real cabin presence, stand-up height, baggage you don't have to think about, range that changes how trips are planned. This is where buyers talk themselves into trouble, because this is what they say. And you've heard it. For the same money, I can get more airplane. I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard that line. And technically, they're right. But what they're really doing is changing ownership class without admitting it. And that's where it gets dangerous, because once you step into true mid-sized territory, the ownership profile changes. Look, you got substantial expenses people don't think about when you start going into these larger aircraft, because crew becomes less optional and maintenance exposure is super high. And parts events, AOG events, they can literally become a 6-figure conversation. I see it happen all the time. And the downtime has real consequences, because you're still operating basically a business, right? That aircraft is a company, and that company has responsibilities and bills to pay, whether it's flying or not. And the Ascend exists to keep buyers from crossing that line too casually, right? It's there to protect you. It says you can have a modern airplane without owning an entire operation. That's the value proposition. And it will work for the buyers who understand what they're buying. All right, the Honda Jet, one of my favorite to pick on. In all seriousness, it's an interesting aircraft. And the Echelon, this airplane represents something very different because it's not aimed at the Honda Jet buyers of today. It's aimed at tomorrow's constraint, which is things like pilot availability and the cost of crewing and operational simplicity and automation. And Honda is making a long-term bet that automation and single pilot optimization will matter more than the size of the cabin over the next 10 years. The Echelon isn't trying to out-cabin a Challenger. It couldn't if it tried. It's trying to outthink it. Expected pricing, right around $12 million. And certification targeted later in the decade. This is not a volume airplane. It's a technology hedge. If the future favors automation and simplified ownership, the Honda looks great. If not, it'll still be a niche. Either way, it tells you where the OEMs think the pressure points are coming from. Let's talk about the big ones, the flagships. Because these aircraft, they're at the top of the ladder. This is where everybody wants to be. This is where everybody aspires to go. Because at this level, jets are not transportation. They're substantial financial instruments. A Bombardier Global 8000 is $80 million. That's insane. It's purchased because, people, they spend that kind of money in an airplane like that because it removes friction, primarily time. It's like a red carpet, right? It's going to remove privacy friction and geographical friction. The same thing with the new Gulfstream with the G800 for $72 million, because these buyers aren't asking, what else should I buy or could I buy? They ask, what will owning this eliminate from my life? It's just completely different math, and it's different rules. And more importantly, it's a super, super small buying pool, which brings us to the part nobody likes to talk about. OEMs do not want more customers. They want better customers. They want fewer customers who are wealthier, who are less price sensitive and way more predictable. And it would help if they complained less too. And that's why entry points disappeared. That's why all these prices have drifted upward. That's why the ladder broke instead of being completely repaired. This is not a failure of imagination. It's a rational response to the risk. But it creates a dangerous side effect, especially in the used market, because when new aircraft prices spike and used aircraft don't reprice rationally, they're going to reprice emotionally. And owners anchor to replacement cost, and lenders are going to stretch to make the deals work, and then the buyers are going to assume that scarcity equals permanence until confidence cracks. And this is where cycles matter, because markets don't turn because airplanes get worse. They turn because buyers stop feeling invincible. When confidence shifts, new orders slow, the used inventory rises, prices discovery returns fast, emotional premiums evaporate. This is where disciplined buyers win. This is where overextended owners get hurt time and time again. And this is where valuation actually matters, because replacement cost is not value. It never was. It's an emotional ceiling, not a foundation. And that brings us to the real point of episode 19. This episode isn't about Mooney or Cirrus or Gulfstream. It's about recognizing that new aircraft are now luxury goods. They're not stepping stones. And used aircraft remain transportation assets. Confusing the two is expensive. Understanding the difference is power. That's the truth about the market in 2026. This has been episode 19 of The Truth About the Market. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. We can't be here without you. Share it with your team. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the feedback and people listening. Tell your broker friends. And until next time, I'm Jason Zilberbrand. This is The Truth About the Market. Fly safe and stay smart. If you found this episode valuable, take a second to subscribe and share it with someone in aviation who could use a dose of market reality. With thousands of aircraft appraisals completed every year, why trust anybody else? Go to VREF.com to learn more.